No marks of injury.
Just 4 large stones in each pocket in the topcoat.
And a last note of madness that could fit.
You sure about madness?
Well, aren't you?
He was diabolical and cunning.
Shrewd and mad, it has been known.
Cool enough to kill twice in one night.
Bold-faced enough to kill 5 times in 10 weeks. Let's call the roll again. Nichols.
Mary Ann, otherwise known as Polly.
Killed 31st of August, between 3:50 and 3:45. Throat cut, body ripped open. Chapman.
Dark Annie.
8th of September, approximately 5:30 a.m. Throat cut, body disemboweled, uterus removed. Stride.
Elizabeth, Long Liz.
30th of September, approximately 1 a.m. Throat cut.
Catherine Eddowes, killed about an hour later the same night. Body ripped open, left kidney removed.
And Kelly?
Mary Jane.
9th of November, sometime in the small hours of the morning. Body cut to pieces and scattered round the room. He must have been mad.
An exhibitionist who boasted about his murders?
A mad sense of humor.
Sick, anyway.
And skilled with it. Skilled enough to kill, rip open a woman and remove chunks of her body, all in 14 minutes.
A working knowledge of anatomy.
Aye.
But not necessarily a doctor.
Not necessarily.
The Sunday Times Herald of Chicago was sure he was a doctor. And they were sure as long ago as 1895, just 7 years after the murder of Kelly.
And who told them?
A Dr. Howard. And a London clubman now in Chicago.
The story Dr. Howard has told is substantially correct, as indeed it should be, since Dr. Howard was one of a dozen London physicians who sat at a court of medical inquiry or as a commission in lunacy on one of their brother physicians. But it was definitely proved that the dreadful Jack the Ripper was no less a person than a physician in high standing, a man enjoying the patronage of the best society in the West End of London. But all parties knowing the facts were sworn to secrecy. Until the time of Dr. Howard's disclosure, this oath had been rigidly adhered to. The circumstances which led to the detection of this inhuman monster with a dual nature are extraordinary and altogether unparalleled in the history of crime. Robert James Lees is the person entitled to the credit of tracking down Jack the Ripper. In his early years, Mr. Lees developed an extraordinary clairvoyant power. One day, he was writing in his study when he suddenly became convinced that the Ripper was about to commit another murder. The whole scene arose before him. He seemed to see 2 persons, a man and a woman, walking down the length of a main street. The woman was half drunk. She leaned against a wall, and the man put one hand over her mouth. She struggled in a feeble manner, but the man drew a knife from his inside pocket and cut the woman's throat. He held his hand over her mouth until she fell to the ground. Then he inflicted several gashes on her with his knife and laid certain organs beside the body of his victim. After which he calmly walked away. Well, so impressed was Mr. Lees with what he had witnessed that he went to Scotland Yard. There, however, they regarded him as little short of a lunatic, and he naturally received little attention. However, on the following night, just such a murder was committed. Some time went by, and Mr. Lees was dining with friends, and he suddenly turned to his two companions and exclaimed, "Jack the Ripper has committed another murder." He and his companions went at once to Scotland Yard. The news of the murder had not yet reached there, but while he was relating his story, a telegram arrived giving full details of the outrage. Well, by now, the police were convinced of Mr. Lee's powers. After an earnest appeal from one of the inspectors, Mr. Lees agreed to try and track the Ripper, much in the same way as a bloodhound pursues a criminal. All that night, Mr. Lees submitted to this strange influence and traversed swiftly the streets of London. The inspector and his men followed behind. At last, at 4 o'clock in the morning, with pale face and bloodshot eyes, the human bloodhound halted before the gates of a West End mansion. Gasping, with cracked and swollen lips, as he pointed to an upper chamber where a faint light gleamed. "There is the murderer, the man you are looking for." "That's impossible," answered the inspector. "That is the residence of one of the most famous physicians in the West End." But when they questioned the doctor's wife, she confessed she did not believe her husband was of sound mind. There had been moments when he'd threatened herself and her children. At such moments, she was accustomed to lock herself up. Within an hour, the inspector had summoned to his aid two of the greatest experts on insanity in the metropolis. When accused, the doctor admitted that his mind had been unbalanced for years, and that of late there had been intervals of time when he had no recollection of what he'd been doing. In one instance, he'd found blood upon his shirt front, which he attributed to a nosebleed. On another occasion, his face had been all scratched up. An exhaustive inquiry before the Commission in Lunacy developed the fact that while in one mood the doctor was a most worthy man, in the other he was a terrible monster. He was at once removed to a private asylum in Islington, and he is now the most dangerous and intractable madman confined in that establishment. In order to account for his disappearance, a sham death and burial were gone through, and an empty coffin, which now reposes in the family vaults at Kensal Green, is supposed to contain the mortal remains of a famous West End physician whose untimely death all London mourned. None of the keepers know that the desperate maniac who flings himself from side to side in his padded cell and makes the long watches of the night hideous with his piercing cries is the famous Jack the Ripper. To them and to the visiting inspectors, he is simply known as Thomas Mason, alias number 124.
A singular Mason?
I'm not running that horse yet.
You should never have entered that one either.
Like to bet on one of Inspector Aberline's favourites?
Well, he was directly involved with the case.
So take a look.
Hey, I know that face, don't I? Does he belong in this case?
Inspector Aberline thought he did. When one of his colleagues brought him in, Inspector Aberline is supposed to have said, "I see you've got Jack the Ripper at last."
Aberline knew his Whitechapel. If he thought that was Jack the Ripper, why didn't he just pull him in?
I assume he couldn't get a case that would stand up in court.
Can you?
I'll have a go. The case against Severin Klasowski, alias Jack the Ripper.
Court's in session.
The Ripper murders began in August 1888. In that same year, Severin Klasowski arrived in England from Warsaw, and he worked as a barber's assistant in Whitechapel. Now, the murders were committed by a man with definite anatomical knowledge. Severin Klasowski had been trained in Poland and with the Russian army as a feldsher. That's an unqualified barber's surgeon come doctor's assistant. And barber surgeons did minor surgery.
Not mass murders.
The murders in England stopped in November 1888. Severin Klasowski left this country around 1889, 1890 and went to America. But there were reports of Ripper-style murders in New Jersey, where he lived during the 2 years that he was there. They were said to have stopped in 1893. And in that year, Severin Klasowski left the United States and came back to England. He turns up in Hastings, but this time he's not called Klasowski. He's running a barber's shop, and he's called...
Chapman, George Chapman.
I thought you'd get it. And also there's a Mrs. Chapman, who plays the piano to the customers while her husband does the short back and sides. This apparently is good for business. So good that they sell the barber's shop. And they buy a lease on a pub called the Prince of Wales in Bartholomew Square, just off the City Road. Now, up till now, Mrs. Chapman, apart from hitting the bottle from time to time, has always enjoyed good health. But suddenly, she begins to suffer from very nasty pains in the stomach. The doctor's called in and prescribes medicines. But it is Chapman who, as you remember, has had some sort of doctor's training, who doles the medicine out, and Mrs. Chapman doesn't get any better. In fact, Christmas Day, 1897, Mrs. Chapman dies. A few months later, Chapman advertises for a young lady to help him in the pub. A girl called Bessie Taylor gets the job. A short while after that, Chapman and Bessie Taylor announce that they've got married. A bit later, the second Mrs. Chapman starts to get pains in the stomach too. And pretty soon, she's dead as well. Chapman, who has by now changed pubs as well and is running the Monument Tavern in Union Street, gets another barmaid, Maud Marsh. They get married. And by October, she's dead too, after the usual pains in the stomach. But, unfortunately for Chapman, though, Maud's parents were very worried about their daughter's pains, so they told the doctor about it. 3 days after Maud died, the police went to see Chapman. And when they searched his rooms, they found some very interesting white powders and some papers which revealed that George Chapman's real name was Severin Klasowski, formerly a barber's assistant in Whitechapel in 1888. And when they brought him in, Inspector Aberlin apparently said, "I see you've got Jack the Ripper at last."
Well, if that's true, he must have killed at least 8 women.
Well, the time fits. And the bit about some medical knowledge fits. And the description, for what it's worth, fits. And there's another connection. A macabre sense of humor.
Which Chapman had too?
Chapman's second wife and victim, Bessie, was buried in Lymm, in Cheshire. And on her grave, Chapman put this verse. "Farewell, my friends, fond and dear. Weep not for me a single tear. For all that was and could be done, you plainly see, my time was come."
Very droll. Is that your case?
It's my case.
Dismissed, I'd say.
Why?
Well, I don't see why a man who killed 5 women with a knife should turn to poison 10 years later.
Wanted to change?
He was hanged in...
1902.
How old was he then?
37.
So at the time of the Ripper murders, he must have been 23, too young.
I don't see...
Remember the eyewitnesses. Take P.C. Smith. The man he saw talking to Longley's stride 20 minutes before she was killed.
Did you look at the man at all?
Yes.
What did you notice about him?
He had a parcel wrapped in a newspaper in his hand. The parcel was about 18 inches long by about 6 to 8 inches broad.
Did you notice his height?
He was about 5'7".
And what about his hat?
He had a dark felt deerstalker hat.
Did you overhear any conversation?
No.
Did you see the man's face?
He had no whiskers, but I did not notice him much. I should say he was about 28 years of age.
28. And that's the youngest estimate in all the descriptions. Now, at 1:35 a.m., 30th of September, with Catherine Eddowes in Church Passage leading to Mitre Square, where she was found murdered, a man, height 5'7", aged 30. Or the man Hutchinson saw going into Miller's Court with Kelly.
He was about 5 feet 8 inches, 34 or 35 years old.
Now, the descriptions have that much in common. Height, about 5'7", aged about 30. Now, you can mistake a man of 30 for 34 or for 28, but not for a man of 23.
A dark, heavy-set man. He could have looked in his 30s when he was only 23. I bet you did.
Case dismissed. You're not still...
No. On George Chapman Klosowski, I'll concede. But that could still be a picture of Jack the Ripper.
How?
Inspector Aberlin never wrote a line about the murders, but a friend of his, a Dr. Dutton, did. He was a keen criminologist, and he filled notebooks with stuff about the Ripper murders. And according to Dutton, Aberlin changed his mind about Klosowski being the Ripper.
Aberlin had long suspected that Klosowski was the Ripper. And discussed the matter with me on many occasions. His original reasons for taking this view were that Klosowski had allegedly been seen with one of the Ripper's victims on the night of the murder. But what finally convinced Aberlin that he'd made a mistake in thinking that Klosowski was the Ripper was his discovery that the Polish barber surgeon had a double in London. This double, a Russian, and also a barber surgeon, sometimes posed as Klosowski, for reasons which were not apparent. It was the Russian surgeon, not Klosowski, who was seen with the Ripper victim.
The reasons are not apparent to Dr. Dutton or to me.
If that were all, you could say it was just a daft theory.
I do.
Dr. Dutton made these notes based on conversations with Inspector Aberlin. But about the same time, and quite independently, the novelist William Le Queux, who was a British agent during the First World War, is given some of Rasputin's papers by the Russians. And according to Le Queux, Rasputin had something to say about Jack the Ripper, too.
Rasputin?
Yeah, the mad monk.
I know who Rasputin is. What's he doing in this?
William Le Queux, best-selling novelist and former secret agent, reveals all.
I personally was told the identity of Jack the Ripper by a Russian anarchist living in London, a member of an anarchist club in the East End. He told me the murders were committed by a Russian called Pt.5, who lived in Westmoreland Road, Walworth. I then discovered the following passage in Rasputin's manuscript. The report of the murders amused our secret police greatly, for as a matter of fact, they knew the whole details all the time and had themselves actively aided and encouraged the crimes in order to demonstrate to the world certain defects of the English police system, there having been some misunderstanding and rivalry between our own police and the British. It was for that reason that Pt.5, the greatest and boldest of all Russian criminal lunatics, was encouraged to go to London and commit that series of atrocious crimes in which our agents of police aided him. Eventually, at the orders of the Ministry of the Interior, the secret police smuggled the assassin out of London. He landed at Ostend and was conducted by a secret agent to Moscow. While he was there, he was, a few months later, caught red-handed trying to murder and mutilate a woman. Eventually, he was sent to an asylum where he died in 1908. Such are the actual facts of the Jack the Ripper mystery, which still puzzles the whole world.
Facts.
He was a best-selling novelist.
Fiction.
That's what makes it odd. Dr. Dutton read that story in Le Queux's Things I Know and decided that they were both talking about the same man.
It's a great pity that Le Queux did not follow up what is a useful clue. Further examination might have shown that Pt.5 was Klosowski's double. A witness at the time of the murders told Aberlin that he should look for a Russian who lived somewhere in Walworth and attended barber shops to cut warts and moles. He said he'd seen this Russian in Commercial Street on the night of the Berner Street murder. What Le Queux should have found out was that Pt.5 worked as a barber surgeon for a hairdresser named Del Hay in Westmoreland Road, Walworth, in 1888.
Fantasy. Mad Russians, anarchists.
The London Post Office Directory, 1888. Westmoreland Road, Walworth. Del Hay, William, hairdresser. And Dr. Dutton has another witness up his sleeve.
I learned from a Dr. Williams who lived in Camberwell and attended St. Saviour's Infirmary in Walworth that a Russian barber surgeon attended him occasionally. Dr. Williams understood that he had degrees as a junior surgeon in Russia and was qualified rather more than a skilled midwife, rather less than the average English GP. This man's name was Pt.5. It appeared that Pt.5 lived in the vicinity, though Dr. Williams could not say where. He also believed that he worked as a barber surgeon at various establishments in the south of London. Ah. He was of medium height, with a dark moustache, sometimes side whiskers, and well-dressed in a rather formal style.
Medical Register, 1888-89, John Frederick Williams, St. Saviour's Infirmary, Walworth, and an address in Camberwell.
You've proved that a hairdresser called Del Hay existed. You've proved that a Dr. Williams existed. But you haven't proved that a man Pt.5 worked for them. I mean, apart from the fact of Le Q allegedly quoting Rasputin, you haven't proved that this man Pt.5 even existed.
Another Russian witness, not an anarchist, but an aristocrat, Prince Belaselsky.
Oh, the names.
The prince got hold of an issue of the Okhrana Gazette, the confidential bulletin of the Tsar's secret police.
Pt.5, Alexei, formerly of Tver, is now officially declared to be dead. Any files or information concerning him should be sent to Moscow Central District. If documents held by you do not contain any of his names or aliases, they should also be examined for any information concerning a man answering to the description of the above, who was wanted for the murder of a woman in Paris in 1886 and the murder of 5 women in the East Quarter of London in 1888. Description: height, medium, usually wore black moustache, curled at ends, broad-shouldered but slight build. Age, 31.
Description fits. The age is about right.
There's another bit at the end.
Known to disguise himself as a woman on occasions, and was arrested in women's clothes in Petrograd before his detention in the asylum where he died.
What are you on about now?
The inquest on Mary Kelly. Remember the evidence of Mrs. Maxwell?
Which you said didn't fit.
The coroner was a bit rough on her, but he couldn't make her change her story.
You must be very careful about your evidence, because it is different to other people's. You say you saw her standing at the corner of the entry to the court.
Yes, on Friday morning from 8 to 8:30.
By that time, Mary Kelly was dead.
I went, saying I could pity her feelings, and went to Bishopsgate to get my husband his breakfast. On the way back, I saw her outside the Britannia talking to a man.
This would be at what time?
Between 8 and 9 o'clock. I was away about half an hour, so it will be about 8:45.
What description can you give of this man?
Oh, I couldn't give you none. They were some distance, but I'm sure it was the dead woman. I'm willing to swear to it.
You are sworn now.
And I shall start swearing soon. Is it your case she didn't see Kelly, but Pt.5 dressed up as Kelly?
Possible.
It's a damn sight more possible the witness got the day wrong.
Maybe. But there were 3 separate people saying that Jack the Ripper was a Russian barber surgeon. And they all 3 called him by the same name, Pt.5. Catch this one a bit more. Dr. Dutton placed Pt.5 in St. Saviour's, Walworth, helping Dr. Williams.
Yeah, I remember.
But there's more.
An interesting aside to this theory is that Annie Chapman, Mary Nichols, and Mary Kelly all attended a clinic at St. Saviour's Infirmary in Walworth, right up till the time of their deaths.
And my interesting aside is that Dr. Dutton was making it all up. Why should all the Ripper victims attend the same clinic, one not even in their own district? Who said they did?
Dr. Dutton in his notebooks.
And where are they?
They've vanished.
Ha! If they ever existed.
There's at least proof that he did. Negative proof. The report of his death in the West London Observer, November the 15th, 1935. Dr. Thomas Dutton, MD, MB, MRCP, LRCS, age 78, of 290 Uxbridge Road, Shepherd's Bush, at one time a brilliant medical man, but who for many years had practically led the life of a recluse, seeing only a few patients, was found dead in his night attire beside his bed last weekend. The rooms in which he lived were dusty and covered with cobwebs, and numbers of papers found gave the appearance of not having been touched for years.
But nothing about the notebook.
Sunday Chronicle, November the 17th, 1935. Secret diary revelations of dead doctor. I knew Jack the Ripper. This dramatic revelation in the secret diary of Dr. Thomas Dutton, the 80-year-old specialist who was found dead at his house in Shepherd's Bush last week, was disclosed to me yesterday by a woman who for years had been one of his few patients. Miss Hermione Dudley, friend and patient of the doctor, told me the story of his passionate interest in crime when I called on her at her Bayswater boarding house.
I knew the doctor when I was quite a young girl. He was then at the height of his fame. An excellent doctor, a brilliant specialist, and an authority on all manner of diseases. But it was as a criminologist that he revealed most of his outstanding genius. By far the most interesting document he compiled was his Chronicle of Crime, 3 volumes of handwritten comments on all the chief crimes of the past 60 years.
So, what happened to them?
My father was one of the few men to whom Dr. Dutton showed this document, and because of my own interest in it, Dr. Dutton gave it to me some time ago. In the first volume, there are several pages devoted to the notorious Whitechapel murders. He often told me, and he repeats it in his diary, that he knew the identity of Jack the Ripper.
And?
The rest is silence. It's nearly 30 years ago. Miss Dudley's vanished, and so have Dr. Dutton's notebooks.
So, who copied them out?
The writer, Donald McCormick, copied bits. He even once had a lead on the prints and the Secret Service bulletin.
But not anymore.
It's a letter I got from Mr. McCormick. Having now written 30 books under one name or another, I fear that I just have to throw out a good deal of past material periodically, if only to make way for new stuff. I can't say what happened to the lithographed copy of the Gazette, which Prince Beliselsky showed me. He lived at Tunbridge in Kent until some years after the war. He was a lonely figure in that he lived on his own, but very gregarious, and daily to be seen in the Rose and Crown there.
But not anymore.
It's all too long ago. Bits of paper that could have been proof have vanished, and unless Dr. Dutton's diaries turn up in an attic somewhere, we'll never know.
Well, that's the way it goes. Some you lose, some you win.
And what have you won?
I didn't win it, not that way anyway. But apart from taking a look at the Home Office closed files...
In your capacity as a Home Office official, I know.
I looked at Scotland Yard closed files, and I found this in a file all on its own, marked confidential.
What's that?
It is the document prepared by Sir Melville Macnaghten, head of CID. It gives the 3 names the police thought could have been Jack the Ripper.
I've read extracts from it.
No, you have not. You've seen quotations from Macnaghten's private papers. This is the official document, written February 1894.
It's 6 years after the last Ripper murder. Why did you write it?
Because the Sun newspaper wrote a series of articles claiming they had found Jack the Ripper.
And the Sun doesn't change its spots, eh?
And only bits of its style.
We know the Christian name and surname of Jack the Ripper.
I can hardly wait.
Its readers had to.
Jack the Ripper has relatives. They are, some of them, in positions which would make them a target for natural curiosity.
And we must abstain, therefore, from giving his name in the interests of the unfortunate, innocent, and respectable connections.
To protect the innocent.
And the paper itself against a little matter of libel. But the son could reveal that he lived with his mother and maiden aunt.
While he has been out through the watches of the night on his fiendish work, one of them has sat up, waiting anxiously for his return. In imagination, picturing this tiger who marched from crime to crime as some innocent, harmless, and helpless child needing protection from the violence of others.
Do we know who the tiger was?
Yeah, a very harmless nut called Thomas Cutbush. He'd been arrested for approaching young ladies and cutting their dresses up the back with a knife.
Not exactly our Jack style.
Oh, Cutbush had been in Broadmoor for 3 years before the sun rubbish appeared. But I suppose MacNaughton thought that he'd better put the record straight.
Thomas Cutbush was arraigned at the London County Sessions in April 1891 on a charge of maliciously wounding Florence Grace Johnson. He was found to be insane and sentenced to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure. Cutbush's antecedents were inquired into by Inspector Race and Police Sergeant McCarthy, CID. The last named officer had been specially employed in Whitechapel at the time of the murders there. Cutbush apparently contracted syphilis about 1888, and after that time led an idle and useless life. His brain seems to have been affected, and he believed people were trying to poison him. He wrote to Lord Grimthorpe and others, and to the Treasury, complaining of a Dr. Brooks of Westminster Bridge Road, whom he threatened to shoot for having supplied him with bad medicines. It was found impossible to ascertain his whereabouts at the times of the Whitechapel murders, but the knife found on him was bought in Houndsditch about a week before he was detained.
So he's a slim prospect indeed.
Oh, he was never in the frame.
So who is? Or was?
Well, MacNaughton thought he'd better spell out the number of Ripper murders because the son claimed there'd been 9.
4 too many.
The Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and only 5. The last murder is the only one that took place in a room, and the murderer must have been at least 2 hours engaged. A photo was taken of the woman as she was found lying on the bed. Without seeing it, it is impossible to imagine the awful mutilation.
That appears in the file, too.
Not good.
Not good.
It will be noticed that the fury of these mutilations increased in each case, and that seemingly the appetite was only sharpened by indulgence. It seems then highly improbable that the murderer would have suddenly stopped short in November 88 and been content to recommence operations by merely prodding a girl from behind some 2 years and 4 months afterwards.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
A much more rational theory is that the murderer's brain gave way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and that he immediately committed suicide. Or, as a possible alternative, was found to be so hopelessly mad by his relations that he was by them confined in some asylum. No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer. Many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on anyone. I may mention the cases of 3 men, any one of whom would have been more likely than Cutbush to have committed this series of murders.
Here we go.
Michael Ostrog, Russian doctor and convict.
Another Russian?
Ah, and a brand new one.
He was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. This man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the times of the murders could never be ascertained. Number 2, Kosminski, Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to years of indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to an asylum about March of 1889. There were many circumstances connected with this man which made him a strong suspect.
No, it's number 3 I'm interested in.
Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor and of good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, and whose body, which was said to have been upwards of 1 month in the water, was found in the Thames on December the 31st, or about 7 weeks after that murder.
He was sexually insane. And from private information, I have little doubt that his own family believed him to have been the murderer.
Montague John Druitt, born 1857, died 1888 in the Thames.
Just 4 large stones in each pocket in the top coat. Doesn't look like a killer, does he?
From private information, I have little doubt that his own family believed him to have been the murderer. Now, if that is right, we're looking at Jack the Ripper.
What do we know about him?
Well, now, he took 7 wickets for 18 runs for Dorset against Wiltshire in 1883. How's that?
The Ripper played cricket?
He also killed himself not long after Mary Jane Kelly was murdered. It's MacNaughton's point, and a good one. Why did those murders stop? One answer. Because Jack the Ripper was dead.
My name's Henry Winslade. I live at 4 Shaw Street, Paxton Road, employed as a waterman. At about 1 o'clock on Monday, December the 31st, I was out on the river when I saw the body floating. Now, the tide was half flood, running up. I brought the body ashore, and I gave information to the police.
EC George Mawson, 216 T Division. I searched the body, which was fully dressed, except for the hat and the collar. In the pockets, I found £2.10 in gold, 7 shillings in silver, 2 pence in bronze, 2 cheques on the London Provincial Bank, one for £50, the other for £16. A first-class season pass, Blackheath to London, South Western Railway. A second half return, Hammersmith to Charing Cross, dated December the 1st. A silver watch with gold chain, with spade guinea attached. A pair of kid gloves, a white handkerchief. There were no papers or letters of any kind. I found 4 large stones in each pocket of the top coat. There were no marks of injury on the body, which was rather decomposed.
My name is William H. Druitt. I live at Bournemouth. I am a solicitor. I am the brother of the deceased. He was 31 last birthday. He was a barrister at law and an assistant master in a school at Blackheath. The last time I saw him alive was when he stayed with me for a night at Bournemouth towards the end of October. I heard from a friend on December the 11th that he'd not been heard of at his chambers for more than a week. I went to London to make inquiries, and at Blackheath I found that he'd got into serious trouble at the school and had been dismissed. I then had his things searched where he resided and found a paper addressed to me.
I have that paper before me now. It's a letter from the deceased to his brother. It reads, "Since Friday, I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die."
Like Mother?
Oh, yeah. The mother had been in a private nursing home since July. She was going mad.
Since Friday. He died too late. That was the beginning of December. The last murder was 9th of November.
Hmm? Check the intervals in between. Nichols, 31st of August. Chapman, the 8th of September. Stride and Eddowes, the double event, 30th of September. And Kelly, the 9th of November. On that basis, when would you next expect the Ripper to kill?
31st, 8th, 30th, 9th. Running 8th and 9th and last day of the month. So, last day of November, the 30th.
Since Friday, I felt. Now, Druitt's body was washed up between Chiswick and Hammersmith. He had in his coat pocket a return Hammersmith Charing Cross train ticket dated December the 1st. So on that day, or shortly afterwards, he killed himself. Now, December the 1st was a Saturday. So that Friday was the last day of the month.
So, what about Druitt?
Ah, well, he went to Winchester and Oxford. They keep good records there. Born 1857, Son of a prominent family in Wimborne and Dorset. Father was a JP, got a scholarship to Winchester. He was secretary of the College of Betting Society, played cricket for the school. Fairly good all-rounder. Except he couldn't act. There is a review of a school performance of Twelfth Night that says, of the inadequacy of Druitt as Sir Toby Belch, what are we to say? It can better be imagined than described.
What about his performance as Jack the Ripper?
Got a scholarship to Oxford, read classics, and read for the bar, was called in Easter 1885 to the Inner Temple. He had chambers at number 9 King's Bench Walk, but he doesn't seem to have practiced. He became a school teacher. Just been fired from a school in Blackheath just before he died.
But he was in and around London during the murders?
Well, he certainly was at the time of 2 of them.
And whose evidence?
The best kind. Not the reminiscences of old Russian aristocrats in the Rose and Crown, but written evidence, the record books. Druitt was a cricketer, remember. Now, Mary Ann Nichols was killed in the early hours of Friday morning, the 31st of August. On Saturday, Druitt was down in Dorset playing for Canford against Wimborne. No alibi, and at least it's negative proof that he was only about 100 miles from London. Now, Chapman was killed at approximately 5:30 on Saturday morning, the 8th of September. Druitt was in London because at 11:30 he was playing cricket at Blackheath, only about 6 miles from Hanbury Street.
Are you saying that the Ripper killed Annie Chapman at 5:30 and 6 hours later was playing cricket?
Well, why not?
Any cricketing evidence that he was left-handed?
Well, this is the Winchester College historian on the subject. Druitt's best games were cricket and fives, and at fives he won the school singles title. Now, to be that good, he must at least have had a lot of strength in both hands. Druitt, to all intents and purposes, was ambidextrous and powerful.
What about anatomical knowledge? Hey, didn't MacNaughton say that he was said to be a doctor?
He was wrong, but not unreasonably. But his father was a doctor, so was his uncle, so was his cousin. He came from a whole family of doctors.
And MacNaughton knew the family?
I don't know that, but remember his own words.
From private information, I have little doubt that his own family believed him to have been the murderer.
And from public deduction, I believe him.
Deduction?
Well, information too, if you like. But at the inquest, William Druitt said categorically that he and the mother mentioned in the suicide note were the only other members of the family.
Well?
It was a lie. A lie from a solicitor, in court, on oath. Druitt was the second of 7 children. I mean, he had another brother, for instance, Edward, 2 years younger. He was a cricketer too and a Royal Engineer.
So why lie?
To save the rest of the family from any taint of madness or any connection between the brother who just thrown himself in the Thames and Jack the Ripper.
You're right to call your source deduction. But what about MacNaughton's private information?
Don't know. Nobody'll ever know. It's the biggest mystery of all. Sir Melville MacNaughton was the only senior police officer ever to put a name to a Ripper suspect. And he comes up with 3 names, writes them down, puts them in an official Yard file, but nowhere else in that file do those names appear, not even in some routine interrogation.
So where did MacNaughton get these 3 names from?
A better question. Where was Sir Melville MacNaughton in 1888?
Was your man? You tell me.
In India, managing the family estates. He didn't join the Yard until a year after the Ripper murders, and he became head of CID 4 years later.
And a leading authority on the Ripper a year after that. Doesn't hang about, does he?
Well, there wasn't so much competition in those days. Senior police officers had to be gentlemen.
So, my question again. Where did MacNaughton get these 3 names?
Well, there are 2 possibilities. In the Home Office suspects file, 22 out of the 48 items listed as being there just weren't there anymore. They'd gone. Now, MacNaughton could have based his list on one of those missing documents.
22 out of 48? Somebody's been a bit careless, haven't they? Or should it be careful?
There's no way of finding out. I mean, they may have been deliberately destroyed, or more likely, somebody has taken them out and just not put them back. They'll be around somewhere in a file marked Whitefish Authority.
So what's the other possibility?
Well, McNaughton was the protege of Monroe, who'd been head of CID just before the murders. But he'd had to resign because he couldn't get on with our old friend.
Sir Charles Warren.
But he was still very much around. The Home Office kept on consulting him, unofficially, of course. So if there had been any private high-level information about the Ripper's identity, Monroe would have known, and he could have passed it on to McNaughton.
But still nothing on the files. No confirmation at all.
Just that one sentence. From private information, I have little doubt that his own family believed him to have been the murderer.
Secrets.
There is another thing. I told you that Druitt had a brother, Edward. Well, he went to Australia in February 1889, not long after the suicide. Now, there was another Druitt in Australia already, a cousin, Lionel. He was a doctor. Now, when Dan Farson did a television program about Jack the Ripper, one of the people who wrote to him said that when he was in Australia, he remembered seeing a pamphlet or a booklet entitled The East End Murderer, I Knew Him, and it was written by Lionel Druitt.
Now I'm interested.
And Farson's correspondent said that the pamphlet was privately printed by Mr. Fell of Dandenong.
It still exists, and we can get a look at it. A quick cable to Australia. I mean, there must be a record of it in the National Library or something. Do you know somebody down there?
Forstall, my dear, what? I'm 10 days ahead of you. I got under Sergeant MacDonald of the Sydney Police. He got the best girl in the business, and that's the cable she sent.
Have checked Sydney libraries and spent 3 days in Melbourne checking every available source, including libraries, historical societies, criminologists, archivists, private collectors, publishers. Stop. Druitt's publication is not listed in Australian bibliographies. Stop. Traced daughter and granddaughter of Druitt, who have no knowledge of Dr. Druitt being in Dandenong or of his writing the article. He was in Tasmania at that time. Tasmanian University medical directories show Dr. Lionel Druitt registered there from May 1891. Stop. A search of directories around 1890 reveals no such person as W.G. Fell. Stop. Best wishes.
Gone missing. Gone walkabout. The only bit of proof vanished.
Ah, it's missing. But there is some evidence that it existed. And that confirms McNaughton's story about the family believing him to be the Ripper. So, as well as all the other points, will you accept M.J. Druitt as Jack the Ripper?
Be a lot happier if that mysterious article turned up.
Druitt was the Ripper, yes or no?
You accept Chapman, Klosowski, or Petachenko?
No.
Was Druitt a Mason?
Oh, you haven't given up on that one? I don't know. There's no way of finding out. You can only back up on the senior ones.
He was.
What's he now?
Like his father, Edward VII. And while we're on the subject, you notice anything odd about him? Looks very like M.J. Druitt.
So he does. The highest in the land?
There's only one problem. To prove that he was Jack the Ripper, we may have to call Queen Victoria a liar.